All right, we're here today to talk about Ted Williams. We're here to talk about Ted Williams in the context of a documentary that's premiering on American Masters on Monday, July 23rd. I believe that's next Monday. It's called Ted Williams, the Greatest Hitter Who Ever Lived. And the man who made the documentary, Nick Davis, is in studio with me. We'll be talking to some other people along the way. I ask you not to be intimidated by this topic if you're not a sports fan. You don't need to be a sports fan to understand this. So I was saying to Nick before we went on the air, Ted Williams kind of fits in certain ways into the category of people like Glenn Gould and Bobby Fischer, people who were geniuses at what they did in a way that made it difficult for them to inhabit the rest of the world, but they also could not successfully inhabit the world in which they were geniuses. And if you find that level of torment kind of interesting, then you don't have to care that much about baseball to understand or to be fascinated by Ted Williams. I will say that I watched the documentary. I cried 4 times. I can't guarantee that you will. But so some of this, quick point of host privilege. So when I was growing up, I spent a lot of time at my grandmother's apartment, a walk-up apartment in Plainville, Connecticut. She had, in place of where a, say, Catholic family would have a votive statue, she had a statue of Ted Williams. And Ted Williams, I think it is fair to say, was her Jesus. And this is not an unusual phenomenon in New England. There was a way in which, particularly for little old ladies in New England, would sit on the porches of their houses in Maine and New Hampshire and Vermont and Massachusetts and Connecticut and Rhode Island, sometimes even keeping score on a yellow pad, listening to the games on the radio. Ted Williams was so much more than just a baseball player. But, I mean, he emphatically was a very, very fascinating baseball player. And my grandmother and I shared that. So there was a time in 1970, 71, somewhere in there, where the Red Sox announced the greatest Red Sox team ever would be honored. And Ted was managing, and they scheduled it for a day when he would be in town as a manager for either the Senators or the Rangers. I've now forgotten. And he was going to be honored, obviously, as the greatest Red Sox player ever. And so I went to the game with my grandmother and my mother, and I took my copy of My Turn at Bat, Ted's memoir, co-written with John Underwood, down to the rail. And there was Ted, and I got him to sign it. And I went back up. And my grandmother kind of couldn't absorb, I think, the fact that I, a mortal, had stood before Ted Williams. It was like I said, look, I just got this thing from Hercules. I thought you'd like to see it or something. She was like, no, she talked about it that way for the rest of her life. So Nick, you come to this not as a Red Sox fan, but as a Mets fan. But I think you very quickly grasped the specialness of Ted Williams. And I think there's like a lot of ways in which he's kind of sui generis. Maybe, I don't know, pick your favorite one. I've got 5 I want to ask.
Well, there are so many incredible aspects to his life. I mean, the obsession, though, I think is what I keyed into really quickly. It's just like, wow, this guy had this ability, but he worked and worked and worked so hard at it. I think I'm a very passionate baseball fan, but I didn't do deep study on Ted Williams until I came to this project. And so my assumption was, oh, yeah, Ted Williams, greatest natural hitter who ever lived. Natural? Yes, he had tremendous natural gifts, but the effort that he put in was just off the charts.
All right, to that point, let's hear a little clip from Nick's documentary.
He was like a Bengal tiger, this beautiful animal that was so captivating, but dangerous at the same time.
If I had met Jesus Christ himself, I couldn't have been more overwhelmed. It was like being in the presence of a deity.
He was almost a godlike figure.
He's a baseball god.
He really studied his game. He was a master at it.
He loved putting on a show.
To look at, he was gorgeous. He was a beauty to watch.
He loved his swing. He had a beautiful swing.
His swing was a work of art.
His bat being the brush and Fenway Park is the canvas.
What he said himself was that his only desire was to walk down the street and have people say, there goes the greatest hitter who ever lived.
He took that one aspect of baseball and perfected it.
Baseball holds out the possibility of perfection, and keep hitting, the game never ends. So it's out there.
He was so focused on what he wanted to do, and it was to the exclusion of everything else.
He was obsessed with hitting.
Everything about him is interesting in this gnarled, difficult way. I mean, he was that way himself. What's the matter with him? What do you constantly asking about that? What's wrong with this guy? What a weirdo. What a great hitter.
That's the voice of the great baseball writer Roger, and so much more. Roger Angell that you hear at the end there. It's Wade Boggs is the one who's saying the thing about the brush and the canvas, which I thought was very good. And I didn't know Wade Boggs had that in him either. So
neither did I.
Yeah.
He was amazing.
Yeah.
Boggs was great,
Right.
and Joey Votto right before
He's
him.
terrific.
Isn't he great?
He's amazing.
Yeah.
I feel like I know a lot about Ted Williams. I mean, Ted Williams is, as you can see, in my blood. But I really didn't know anything about Ted Williams in a way because I never quite understood the really primal beginnings of his brokenness. This is one of the things that I think really jumps out in this documentary that you describe. It's almost like Citizen Kane or something, having the sled, spoiler, rested, I mean, being torn away. There's like a way in which he's broken right at the beginning. Maybe you can say a little bit about that.
Absolutely. He came from a really unhappy childhood, and he never talked about it. He didn't talk about it with his children. He didn't talk about it with his wives. He didn't talk about it with anyone. But clearly it drove him. And he was born into poverty in San Diego. His father was a ne'er-do-well and a drunk. His mother worked for the Salvation Army, and she was out all day long into the wee hours of the night saving souls, but not the souls of her own two sons, who were kind of the first latchkey kids. And Ted felt abandoned, and then on top of that had to suffer with the then indignity of the fact that his mother was Mexican-American. And so there was just this deep shame and rage that came from that drove him throughout his life.
The Mexican part of it, I was very fascinating to me. If I had known that before, it slipped out of my mind, or maybe it just was not commonly known.
Exactly. Me too. I had this sort of vague notion as a baseball fan, like, oh, yeah, Ted Mexican, maybe part Mexican or whatever. But when you really get into it, you see that it was there all along. We spoke to one of his cousins, Frank Venzor. And you look at Frank Venzor and think, well, that's a Mexican guy. And Ted was quoted as saying, if I'd looked like my brother, later in life, he said, if I'd looked like my brother, I never would have played the major leagues. So there was, this was pre-1947, obviously. It's before Jackie Robinson breaks the color barrier. So Ted wants nothing to do with his Mexican relatives. There's a story where he comes into the train station at the end of his, I think it's his final minor league season, and he sees waiting for him all his relatives. And as Ben Bradley in the film describes it, the great biographer of Ted in the book The Kid, he says, Ted took one look at this motley crew of Mexicans and hightailed it in the other direction. And he wanted nothing to do with them. And Frank Venzor tells the story, too. He was laughing. I mean, he just didn't want anything to do with us.
Right. And just to tear one or two more stitches out of this primal wound, too. So you have this mother who's not only away all day, but sometimes away for like 2.5 days, right? Leaving kids alone while she goes and saves souls as a full-time Salvation Army worker. His dad is on the road a lot and a drunk. And you describe how when the major leagues came calling, they became very, very interested in getting together around the subject of his contract. Right?
Well, Ted's father came back for a brief time and sort of oversaw the contract and made sure that he got some of the bonus, and then went back to wherever it was that he was.
And so neither one of them ever saw him play professional baseball?
It appears, and John Thorne, the baseball official historian for Major League Baseball, tells us that his parents never saw him play a game of Major League Baseball. On their behalf, I will say, they're in San Diego, he's in Boston. It's an awfully long train trip, but still.
Well, yeah. So I just feel like other parents probably would have made that trip. But so, what you get is, and I don't want to like DSM-5 this guy, but there is something called borderline personality disorder where people who have that diagnosis often can't really modulate between a slight and a profound wound.
Yeah.
And Williams seems like that guy very early on. In the documentary, they talk about, by his second season, after this prodigious rookie year, by his second season, anytime he seemed kind of normal, there might be, 100 people out of 25,000 people booing,
Yeah.
And that was more than he could stand.
Yeah, he would seize upon any slight. It's interesting. It's a great question because I don't know whether that's being overly sensitive or Ted knowing himself and knowing that he hits better mad. And so sort of almost like, picking at a scab intentionally so that it can drive him to even greater performance.
Right. But he decides, I think in that second season.
Yeah, I'm not gonna tip my cap.
He's not going to tip his cap to the crowd.
No, if you SOBs are going to boo me, you don't get to. I'm going to give it right back.
And also at that time, he completely. I mean, there's a lot of athletes who don't like the press, but this goes into a different area. I mean, and there's a lot of athletes who their way of solving that problem is to never speak to the press again. Ted, I got the feeling, didn't exactly do that. Once again, maybe he just thought, I'm better off just openly hating these people. It'll fuel me.
Yeah, I mean, he didn't have a public persona, He just, what you saw was what you got with Ted. And so he'd be angry at the press, and he'd tell them so, and they'd write nasty stories about him, and it would go back and forth like that. But no, he didn't try to hide from them or pretend he liked them.
So one of the things you and I were talking about before we went on the air, so My Turn at Bat, which is, he has a co-writer on this, and I read it like 5 times or something as a young person. He takes all of that, or he and his co-writer take all of that, and it's really kind of a funny book in a lot of places. And there's one story that that stayed with me. I haven't read the book in years, but as you point out in the documentary, he often preferred the company of like firefighters and cops and people like that or the clubhouse manager Johnny Orlando to his fellow baseball players or anyone else. And there's a moment where he's in the book where he's had a bad day and he's furious, and the crowd's maybe been on him, and he's throwing his stuff into the locker, and in the presence of the press, he says, "Screw it. I'm just going to go be a fireman." And they, of course, take it and run with it. Yeah. And they've got all these headlines. And he goes, and I think he plays in Chicago. That's the next place he plays. And as he steps up to the plate, sirens go off. And like out in center field, they've given free seats to the entire Chicago Fire Department. They all put their helmets on, and it's all this stuff, and they're ringing bells and stuff like that. Yeah. And I think actually some of the players, like in the dugout from Chicago, are ringing fire bells and stuff. And it's all, there's this thin-skinned guy, so what can we do to him?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think he did have a good sense of humor and a decent sense of humor about himself. There's another great story that we just didn't have time for, but it'll be in the DVD extras and stuff, where maybe this one, the Pedro Ramos story. This rookie pitcher for the Washington Senators strikes him out, and then after the game goes into the Red Sox clubhouse and asks Ted Williams to sign a ball. And Williams he can't believe it. But, the other Red Sox players are kind of laughing, and Williams is like, all right, he signs the ball, hands it back to the kid. Sure enough, 3 or 4 weeks later, the Senators come back to are playing the Red Sox again. Williams, facing Ramos, hits a prodigious home run deep into the stands, and as he's rounding first base, he tells Ramos, I'll sign that son of a bitch too if you can find it.
And I'm sure that wasn't the only expletive that he probably used.
Probably
one of the points
not.
That you make in the film is that he could string swear words together in a more creative way than almost anybody.
Yeah.
So I want to play another clip here. This because this sort of gets to some of the things we're talking about. There is a way in which the more you watch him, the more he does strike you as lonely. And lonely, I don't know, Updike in his famous piece about Williams compares him to Achilles. There's sort of a sense in which he's sulking in his tent a lot of the time, but he's sulking alone. So let's just hear a little bit more from the documentary.
I think he was lonely. I think that he had a difficulty in making attachments.
There were certain teammates that he was close to, but he seemed to be more comfortable with regular guys, cops, firemen, clubhouse boys. Maybe in any relationship like that, he would be the dominant figure and maybe therefore more comfortable. When his first child arrived, Ted was off fishing in Florida.
And when sports writers talked to him about it, he was not happy to talk about it.
He said he'd planned to be there, but the baby came 2 or 3 weeks early, and he said he couldn't get a flight back, which was probably baloney. He took a lot of heat for that, but he was Ted Williams. He was going to do things his way.
It was sort of symbolic of Ted's domestic relations that happened.
Ted was certainly couldn't have been easy to be married to. He was this great star, and he took full advantage of the privilege of being a star. Ted and his first wife had a messy divorce in which Williams, trying to lower the alimony, threatened to retire from baseball. We missed the first few months of the season. And then as soon as he reached a settlement with his wife, unretired and came back.
You're hearing from the documentary Ted Williams, The Greatest Hitter Who Ever Lived, which premieres on American Masters on Monday here on CPTV at 9 p.m. I'm here with Nick Davis, who made this documentary. Listening to all that and the other stuff, the spitting at the fans, and, one of the things that he can't be, he really is arguably the greatest hitter ever. But I don't know if you were watching the All-Star game on Tuesday night, but there's one point where the guy who's probably the best player in baseball right now is Mike Trout. He's standing out in center field, and somehow or other they mic him up so he can talk to the guys in the booth while he's playing center field. So he's watching and he's talking, he's watching and he's talking, and he's, joking with them, but also talking, seriously answering their questions. And in fact, the last thing that happens is that there's maybe a 3-2 count, and Trout, who's standing there in center field playing the All-Star game, goes, "What do you think it's going to be? Slider inside?" And then the guy throws it, and you hear Trout go, "Nope, heater." And you just think, this is so far out of the range of what Ted Williams would do. There's that term, ambassador for the game, right?
Yeah.
And Mike Trout is a great ambassador for baseball.
Yeah.
And Williams really was an anti-hero before that term was in circulation.
Yeah, I mean, he was huge and larger than life and was such an icon of the game, but he would not have been a representative of the game in any kind of public way. He wasn't DiMaggio, the great DiMaggio, Hemingway wrote about. So, I mean, and in some ways, the relationship between Joe and Ted is so interesting, and we go into it in the documentary a little bit, because Joe did have an image that he had to live up to.
He curated it.
He curated it, right, exactly. He was a curator of his own image, and his sister-in-law tells us that he ironed his own underwear. But, Ted just let it all hang out and was not that way. So he wasn't gonna be nice for the sake of the game.
Right. I think, once again, I'm taking the risk of a little bit of psychoanalysis, but there's a way in which DiMaggio very much courts the love of the public and plays the role of a conventional kind of crossover celebrity, up to and including marrying Marilyn Monroe. There's a way in which, for Williams, it's clear at the beginning, you can never love me enough to heal what's wrong with me. So don't bother trying to love me. And
Right.
I'm not going to bother trying to get you to love me either. I'm just
Right.
not interested in that.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, the Achilles is a great example. But, there's no question he had flaws, and he used those flaws and kind of picked at them to drive him on, I think.
What the other thing that Williams has, despite everything that we're just saying, so he's sort of an anti-hero. He's a guy who doesn't really know or care to curate his own public image. But he also has, I think maybe it's a product of that intensity and the sort of a Achillean quality, if we're going to go with that, a flair for the dramatic. There's just a way in which there's certain things that he does, probably. And so you have never before seen in this documentary. You have color footage of the last swing he ever took as a major league player. It was the occasion for a fabulous John Updike essay in the New Yorker. But you got this somehow, right?
Yeah, incredible kismet and luck. The last game, Ted's last game, has become so mythical in large part, I think, because of Updike's piece, Hub fans bid Kid adieu. And, everybody wanted it. Everybody wanted him to hit a home run. There were only 10,000 fans at the game that day, but Ted delivered. But so this is this mythical moment in baseball history, and we've been working on this film for over 2 years and had got all the footage from everybody, and there's this, black and white footage that everybody's seen a million times, and it's okay, it's good. But on the day before we finished the film, we locked the picture. I got an email out of the blue just to my info at, Nick Davis Productions email address from a guy in Boston who had been, I think, a 19-year-old art student who cut school that day, took his 8mm camera.
Marty Zapruder, actually. It was Abraham's grandson.
Right. No, it was even before Abe.
That's right.
Right.
Before
So,
Abe, that's right, yeah.
and this guy, Bill Murphy, who took his camera out to Fenway and incredibly walked around and got every at bat from a different angle. of Ted's last game. Incredible raw color footage that brings the whole day to life in an incredible way. And then you had it developed, showed it to some friends and family, and then stuck in a drawer for over 50 years. And every once in a while, he would wake up and think, geez, in the middle of the night, I got to do something with this. But he never did anything. And then finally, just total serendipity, he emailed us the day before we locked footage and said, oh, I've had this footage lying in a drawer. Would this be of interest to you? I was like, would this be of interest? It's the Holy Grail. Yes, it would be of interest. Send it on. So we pushed our schedule back and got the footage. It's incredible, and it gives such drama, even more drama to that day to have this footage bring everything to life.
You also have, is it Jack Fisher? Is that his name?
Jack Fisher, the
pitcher who faced him.
Yeah, I mean, I remember when Vic Wertz died, it said, Vic Wertz, man who hit ball, Mays caught. And these guys who are on the wrong end of history, Buckner, it's always very interesting. He was totally delightful and happy. He was wonderful to talk to, and says, as he was going out to Fenway that day, it was rainy, it was drizzly, it was not a good day for baseball. And he just sort of embodies old-time baseball and tells the story of being on the mound and pitching and giving up the home run. He
has this nice perspective, too. I mean, visual perspective, because, so Williams hits a home run in his final at-bat, and bear in mind, if you're just kind of tuning into the Ted Williams story, Ted Williams has this fractious and permanently fractured relationship with the fans, and he's just cavorting around the bases. This tremendous Updike has this great description of just him rounding the bases like he's almost floating or something, and everybody's thinking, well, now he's going to tip his cap, and he just runs into the dugout and nothing happens. And Jack says,
and Fisher's on the mound, and even he thinks the guy's got to come out and take a curtain call or something. And he takes his time. He picks up the rosin bag. He's just sort of wasting time. And he looks in the dugout, and Williams waves at him and says, "No, I'm not coming back."
And at this point, the umpires and the players,
everyone is beseeching him. Come on, let's go. But as Updike famously wrote, "Gods do not answer letters."
Right. And I mean, it's an interesting thing too, because another part of one of the other stories that you tell, and I think we'll get to it a little bit more in the next segment, but, those last two games, the year that he hit 400, but you start with a description of the fact that, so here's this incredibly tense day. Is this guy going to be able to hit 400? And the umpire is brushing off the plate, and he's like talking to Williams saying, you're going to have to be loose. If you want to hit 400, you're going to have to be loose. Umpires typically do not give advice, particularly in the presence of the other team's catcher. And so here's this notion of this guy who's so hard to like in some ways, but I think people also kind of appreciate the quest he's on.
Well, the respect that he earned. At another point, Jim Cott tells us that, when you were facing Williams, anything close, if he took it, the umpire's going to call it a ball, because if Ted took it, it must be a ball.
Right.
I mean, he engendered this respect and awe and admiration from the other players, as difficult and as prickly, and the umpire, clearly, as prickly as he must have been. So, umpire Bill McGowan says, in order to hit 400, a man has got to be loose. He's got to be loose.
So my least favorite thing to talk about in connection with Ted Williams is the whole cryonics part of it. And although it does fit with the notion of immortality, if we're going to talk about sort of godlike beings and stuff like that, but we should say something about this anyway, because in a weird way, it's the only thing baseball fans do know about him. Isn't he the guy who got frozen?
Yeah, I mean, non-baseball fans, absolutely. It's like that's the one thing they remember. And it's unfortunate, but there is something kind of fitting about it, because it's weird and gnarled, just like his life was. For me, we have a PBS hour to tell the story of this man and his life and what drove him. So what happens to him after his life ends, it's not actually that relevant, except for why in the world did he agree to do this? And Claudia Williams, his daughter, who's incredibly eloquent and articulate.
She's wonderful.
Yeah, and also you feel, what I like best about Claudia is you feel him in her interview. You sort of get the sense of like, what an interesting, complicated man he was just by just seeing it in her eyes.
Yeah.
And, well, first of all, once I went to her, obviously a key interview for us was getting her, and I told her, look, she was so burned, to pardon the pun, but by the whole freezing thing. And what happened after he died, and there was such controversy, and she felt her family had just been absolutely raked over the coals, her and her brother John Henry, that she didn't want to have anything to do with the press. And it was only when I said to her, look, we're really only interested in finding out what made this man tick and who he was as a person and telling that story. We don't have time to get into the controversy. It's fascinating. It could be its own hour or more, a feature film, what happened to Ted Williams' body. But that's not what the film's about. So she consented to be interviewed, and then gave a wonderful interview and explained that the reason he said, okay, fine, it's not like he believed in it, but he thought, look, I see what this is doing. The fact of my mortality is making my kids so upset. I was a terrible father, so I want to make it up to them if this is something that really means a lot to them. Hell, I don't know. I mean, 1,000 years ago, we didn't have a device that could, communicate across the globe with other people and have all the information the world's ever had on it. So maybe it'll happen. Who knows? Why not? I'll do it.
Maybe I can be a great dead father.
Exactly.
All right. We have to take a break here.
Okay.
We want to talk a little bit more. We're going to get down to baseball brass tacks even more when we get back. We'll also be talking about Moxie, the great New England beverage associated with him, at the end of the show.
Dust right off his cleats. The roaring crowd comes to its feet. The pitcher's knees are getting weak. Then the announcer begins to speak. It's number 9 for the Boston Red Sox. The Splendid Splinter steps into the box.
Ted Williams, in his entire major league career, when you count hits and walks, was on base more than any other player in baseball history.
I'll look at his career numbers. He's just so clearly better than everybody, save Babe Ruth. There's Babe and there's Ted like neck and neck, and then everybody is so far. It's not even close.
He is the greatest hitter that ever lived. It's not even an argument.
This is the voices of Dick Enberg, Joey Votto, and Wade Boggs, all in Nick Davis's documentary, Ted Williams, the greatest hitter who ever lived, which will be on the American Masters.
American Masters. Yeah, Monday night.
On Monday night. You'll also be able to stream it, I'm told, on our cptv.org website. So that's probably the wrong way to say the website now, but I'm sticking with it. So we want to investigate that whole question right now. And joining us to help out is Sam Miller, a national baseball writer at ESPN. He's joining us by Skype. Sam Miller, are you with us?
I am. How you doing?
Good. So, as Nick's documentary points out, you're hearing Wade Boggs say there's no argument about this. I think Nick's documentary is a little bit more ambivalent about this. There's no question that that's what Ted Williams set out to do. That was the grail he'd set up for himself. As somebody looking at it dispassionately, how close do you feel that he came?
Well, I think that as far as hitting specifically, there's only 3 names that you could possibly consider, and those names are Babe Ruth, then Barry Bonds, and Ted Williams. And Ruth is a little bit of a complicated case just because of when he came along, the game wasn't nearly as developed and I would say consistently professional as it is now. And Barry Bonds, of course, is a very complicated case because the years when he rivals Ruth and Williams were tainted by the, performance-enhancing drugs we have every reason to believe he was taking. And Ted Williams is much less complicated. He was just a pure hitter, a perfect hitter. He did things that throughout his career you almost can't believe he was able to do in the context of his league. He was one of the best young hitters of all time, maybe one of the 2 or 3 best young hitters ever. He was one of the 2 or 3 best old hitters ever, and his entire career was pretty much unblemished from an offensive standpoint. I don't know if that necessarily makes him the best baseball player. I think that there's more to his job than just hitting, and if there is any knock on Ted Williams at all, it's that he wasn't as well-rounded as guys like Willie Mays and Mike Trout, who are also in the conversation for the best player of all time. But just from an offensive standpoint, his player page at Baseball Reference is one of the great resources on a boring afternoon. You can open it up and find 50 fun facts within about 20 minutes. Right.
In an era where we talk about 5-tool players, Ted Williams is a 2-tool player, and his defense was such that, it may have been overplayed a little bit how bad his defense was, but supposedly Jimmy Pearsall, one of the talented outfielders who's charged with playing next to him, would sometimes growl at him, if I have to play your position too, at least get out of my way. So Nick Davis, one of the things that complicates the Ted Williams statistical profile is something that, I mean, Ted Williams clearly regarded any moment when he wasn't playing baseball as a tremendous loss to both him and the universe. And there were many moments like this because he was pressed into military service twice. Maybe you can just quickly say a little bit about that.
Yeah, he lost nearly 5 years to the two wars, 3 to World War II and close to 2 to Korea. And, he was not happy about it. I mean, incredibly, he served, and there is this idea of him as this American icon who did sacrifice nearly 5 years of his career to the wars. And very few players went to Korea. I mean, Korea especially got under his skin because he hadn't left the reserves, and therefore when they needed pilots, he was called up, and he was very upset about it and fought it and tried not to go. But what would his numbers have been like had he gotten those nearly 5 years, and all kinds of sabermetricians, and Sam may know better than I what the predictions would have been. Would he have cracked 700 home runs or, hung around to get close to Ruth? I do want to point out just something about the film, which is that the film is called Ted Williams, quote, the greatest hitter who ever lived. It is not the film's contention that he's the greatest hitter who ever lived. It's that's what drove him.
So, Sam, to that point, I mean, when people are having these kinds of rainy day discussions, they try to figure things out, and there are vagaries of fate that can affect somebody's performance. Thurman Munson dies young in a plane crash. Mickey Mantle's knees go out in a way, he just has sort of injury problems that inhibit him and limit him. I don't know. There's a way in which, like, having to go fight for your country feels a little bit different from those things, but a little bit the same. How do baseball people talk about this?
Well, before I answer that, you should just note that baseball statistics in general, the ones that kind of are a big part of our lore, are biased against hitters like Ted Williams, because so much of Ted Williams' offensive value and genius was his ability to draw walks, get on base, control the strike zone. And when you think about the biggest offensive stats for a hitter in popular culture, they're the Triple Crown stats, right? Batting average, home runs, and RBIs. And you're probably not going to draw, to get an RBI when you draw a walk. You're definitely not going to hit a home run when you draw a walk. And really working deep counts to draw walks also puts you in a position to strike out a little more often. So it has a subtle effect downward on your batting average. And those are all things that when we talk about Babe Ruth, you point to the home run record or the incredible RBI totals that Lou Gehrig had. And Ted Williams' genius was that he was uncompromising. He wanted to help his team score runs. He knew that getting on base was going to do that. He knew that going outside of the strike zone to be more aggressive was going to hurt that. And so even if he had those years that he lost to military service, I think it's probably unlikely that he would have reached the kind of classic statistical heights that we associate with guys like Hank Aaron and Babe Ruth. I think that there's a case to be made that if he'd been at, say, 670 or 680 home runs instead of 520, it might have given him the incentive to keep playing an extra couple years. He was obviously still one of the very best hitters in the world when he retired. And if he only needed 35 or 40 more home runs to catch Babe Ruth, perhaps he might have chosen to do that. But to me, the real loss from those years from a sort of legacy or historical perspective is that the Red Sox were really good those years. They were in second place the year before he went to serve in World War II. They won the American League the year that he came back. I don't know how good that club would have been in those 3 years, but you can certainly see the case that the Red Sox would not have gone almost a century without a world title if they'd had those 3 years with Ted Williams in his prime and a very good team competing for the World Series those 3 years. Actually,
when you say the things you were saying at the beginning, Sam, I'm thinking here in this era where a lot of people look at things like OPS, maybe Ted Williams' numbers would be even better because you do get credit for getting on base.
I just want to jump in. You get a lot more credit now than you did then.
Right.
I think it was only with this statistical revolution and the sabermetricians in the 70s and 80s and Bill James and all that where people have re-looked again and thought, God, Williams really was good. And he was right to lay off those pitches.
All right. I want to just there's one thing that even using the more conventional metrics that contributed to things like Triple Crowns, you can't take away from Ted Williams. So let's hear that.
He went into the last day, which was to be a doubleheader, hitting 399.5, which on the books would have been rounded up to 400. So everyone wanted to know, was he going to play or sit it out and take the rounded 400? Joe Cronin, his manager, thought he would bench Williams.
Joe Cronin, the manager, says, you can sit if you want.
Well, I never give it a thought about not playing. I knew I was going to play, and there's no doubt about it.
He was going to earn it. He wasn't going to let some statistician round off a number to make it 400.
Well, as I got up the home plate, the first time up during the day, Bill McGrown, one of the truly great umpires that ever been in this game, he called time, and he turned his back towards the stands, and he started brushing home plate. And he said, in order to hit 400, he says, you got to be loose. You got to be loose. And he wiped the plate off and went back. And the catcher said, Mr. Mack says not to give you anything, but he told us to pitch to you today.
And he went 6 for 8 on the day.
And raised the batting average to 406. That's a man's man thing to do.
In the locker room after the game, Ted turned to the clubhouse boy, Johnny Orlando. You know, he said, I'm a pretty good hitter.
That sounds like John Hamm at the end. That's
it
'cause
is John Hamm.
Yeah. So Sam, I kind of already know what your take on this whole hitting 400 thing is because you're on the record about it. So tell us what you think of this feat and the likelihood of it being equaled.
Well, it will never be. There is virtually no chance that anybody will ever hit 400 again unless the game changes in such a way that it's almost unrecognizable to the game that we have been playing for the last 6 decades. Records are they're tied to the era they're played in. And when you look at what baseball was like in the 1920s and 1930s, there were just so much fewer strikeouts than there are now. And some people might say, well, hitters were better contact hitters back then. But really, it's that pitchers pitch for strikeouts. Pitchers are throwing much harder. There are many more relievers coming in throwing 100 miles an hour, and even the extreme contact outliers are striking out 4 and 5 times as much as the contact hitters of that era. And if you look at batting average as a pretty simple mathematical equation between how often you strike out and make an out, how often you hit a home run and get a hit, and then what percentage of balls that you hit in the field of play land safely, you add all these strikeouts that we have today, and the math becomes virtually impossible. Nobody's really come close in an extremely long time, and the trend is just going more and more. Nobody, I think, in this decade has carried a 400 average even into June. So it's basically impossible, and that might seem like in some ways it diminishes what Ted Williams did because it ties his accomplishment to his era. And that's probably fair. That's probably true. I mean, I don't think Ted Williams' greatest offensive achievement is that batting average. I think it's his career on base percentage, which is to me a lot more impressive. But even at the time, it was almost impossible to hit 400. There were, I think, 9 400 hitters between 1920 and 1930. And after that, the game had already started to change. And there wasn't another one until Ted did it in 1941. And so he was already a real outlier, and his season is remarkable. And when you look at what he did that year, he hit 37 home runs and struck out 27 times, which is just unthinkable in this day and age. Well, it was unthinkable in that day and age too. So that probably speaks to how out of time he was.
It's just kind of interesting to me that we're having this conversation, Sam, at the time when there is another season unfolding that involves the Red Sox and the Yankees. I mean, we've been talking about Williams and DiMaggio for a while. There's a season unfolding here. Nick is a Mets fan, so we just have to make him a cup of tea and wish him well. But there's a season unfolding here that feels as though it has some of the kind of history potentially attached to it. There's these two teams that, are playing kind of above just about everybody else at this point. And J.D. Martinez, in some ways, has a little bit of Ted Williams in the sense that he's the designated hitter for the Red Sox. He's apparently obsessed with watching video of previous at-bats and kind of cataloging any mistake he might have ever made and that kind of stuff. There's a way in which Benintendi has that beautiful swing you associate with Williams. So, Sam, I'm assuming as a baseball writer, you think this season has some real potential to it.
I mean, every season has a lot of
I
real
guess that's
potential to it. It's a great sport because nobody's writing down a plot for them to follow, and almost anything can happen any year. I mean, you mentioned that the two teams, the Yankees and the Red Sox, are both on pace to win 107 or more games, and one of them is going to have to fight through a wild card, and that's already a great storyline of the year. But the Astros are also an incredible team, and some of the individual performances around baseball are, I mean, we have a hard time recognizing just how great the best of our era are. And Ted Williams was, I think in a lot of ways, was overlooked during his own time. He was constantly underappreciated in MVP voting. He was criticized for fairly petty shortcomings. And right now, I think that we have an all-time great player in Mike Trout. We have a all-time great player in Mookie Betts. I don't know that we treat either one of those as historically significant as I think they are. In 70 or 80 years, people are still going to be talking about what Mike Trout is as a player, what Mookie Betts has done as a player this year, and probably what the Astros, Yankees, and Red Sox are doing as three unbelievably strong teams fighting against each other in one league.
You know, Nick, a few seconds ago, I committed an act of apostasy by saying, well, J.D. Martinez kind of reminds you of Ted Williams and his obsessive study of hitting, and Benintendi's got that sweet swing. It's really kind of wrong in an oddly almost theological way to say anybody's like Ted Williams. But there's somebody in your documentary who is used as a Ted Williams simulator, a guy who just did get called up to the Astros, I think. And there was an instinct to maybe protect this guy, right, from those comparisons.
Yes, there was. I mean, we wanted to use some very tasteful and almost hidden recreations, and I think a lot of people who've seen the film, we've had some private screenings and stuff. We'll talk about the recreations afterwards, and they say, "What recreations? I didn't catch that." But we do some super slow motion, high speed, 2,000 frames a second stuff where we have a hitter in a number 9 Red Sox uniform, vintage away uniform from 1941 and home uniform from the 50s, swinging a bat, and it's a gorgeous left-handed swing, and you don't see the face or anything. But we did a major search to try and find someone, and you think about great left-handed hitters like Benintendi or whoever, and you'd think, oh, this guy reminds me of Williams, and then you look at them side by side and think, no, that's not right. But there was a kid in the farm system of the Houston Astros at the time, and we were sent his swing, and we thought, look, he's in the minors, but he's got a great swing. It doesn't matter if he's actually a good hitter. He just needs to look like a good hitter. And reached out to him, and they said, yes, sure, you can do it. And so we filmed these recreations with this kid under the strict instructions. Sure, you can do it, but you can't name him because you don't want anybody saddled with that. As you were just saying, you don't want anyone coming up. And as a Mets fan, I can tell you, when the black Ted Williams arrived in the form of Darryl Strawberry, it was tremendous pressure to put on a young man, and Strawberry didn't exactly rise to the occasion ultimately. But anyway, we got this guy, and then the Astros in spring training just started calling him Ted because of the way he looked. And they didn't know that we'd done this film. Anyway, the kid's name is Kyle Tucker, and he's been called up, and so now he's playing left field for them.
And he's been outed, too. All right, so thanks to Sam Miller, a national baseball writer at ESPN. Nick Davis is still with me in studio, producer and director of Ted Williams. Quote, the greatest hitter who ever lived, close quote. We'll be back to talk about Moxie, which is a big part of the story, as far as I'm concerned.
Can you catch? Will you hold the ball when you step to the plate? Will you swing and fall? If you play, you gotta know how it's done. Can you catch? Can you hold a hard one?
Usually, Wolfie says the credits right here, but she's not around today, so I'm going to say the credits. Katie Tolarski is running the board today. That's like having Ted Williams, I don't know, hit batting practice for your American Legion team or something like that. But she's like the big boss of everything here. But she's running the board because Wolfie's not around. Jonathan McNichol is the guy who produced this show. Jason Parros, our terrific intern, is helping out as well. Tomorrow, The Nose, our weekly cultural roundtable, we're going to see a documentary called 3 Perfect Strangers about 3 identical twins separated at birth. I think we're also talking about Hannah Gadsby's comedy on Netflix. Right now, we're talking about Ted Ted Williams with Nick Davis, who produced and directed the Ted Williams documentary that will air on American Masters on Monday and stream also on American Masters on Monday. I said I cried 4 times. One thing I just want to emphasize here is that if you're not a baseball fan, you'll cry 2 times. If you can get through the kids with cancer scene without crying, there's something wrong with you. And some of the stuff with these kids might make you cry. What he says at Cooperstown about Negro League players should make you cry. You don't have to care about baseball to fall in love with this TV show, this documentary. So very quickly, one of the things that Ted also did was he was, for a while, an advertising spokesperson for a drink that's the perfect New England drink, just in the same way that Ted Williams, although he was from California, had this kind of perfection for the unflinching, non-truckling, uncompromising, flinty character of New England. Moxie is the perfect drink for New England because it doesn't really exactly taste particularly great, but there's something about it that's very New Englandy, and my grandmother loved Ted Williams, and she loved Moxie. So Jim Baumer is the Maine-based writer and author of Moxie, Maine in a Bottle. Jim Baumer, tell us, I guess we don't have a lot of time here, but it would be good to talk quickly about the origins of Moxie. We have to go back to General Augustine Thompson, do we not? Dr. Augustine Thompson.
Well, thanks for having me on. A great show so far. Thompson was actually from Maine. He was born in Maine, but he actually invented the drink when he moved to Massachusetts. So certainly a New England drink. It gets attached to Maine, but it's safer to say it's definitely a New England-based drink. And
we should say that back in those days, this is sort of shortly after the Civil War, drinks of this kind were usually kind of marketed as kind of medicinal tonics. This one was supposed to prevent softening of the brain and loss of manhood and all kinds of other problems that people might have been having. But it became incredibly popular. By the 1920s, I think it's for a while outselling Coca-Cola. And so can you just quickly talk about the advertising of the drink? Because that's one of the reasons it was outselling Coca-Cola. They were very creative about marketing.
Yeah, so there was a guy named Frank Archer who really was a marketing genius behind Moxie. Without Frank Archer, there would not be a Moxie today. He would have been the Ted Williams of marketing, so to speak. And, as he sort of was phased out at the end of his life, which is pre-World War II, Moxie really began to languish. So Moxie went from being a soft drink probably close in proximity to Coca-Cola and Pepsi in popularity. And then after World War II, they really struggled. And part of it was Archer was out of the picture. They had no real clue on how to market the drink, and then latched on to Ted Williams in the middle 50s. But they even had a hard time deciding whether or not to pull the trigger on, signing Ted up. And, he was being paid next to nothing. They paid him $1,000 a year, which is about $10,000 in today's money, with stock options and with a company that was really, some people thought was going down the tubes. Well, fortunately it didn't. But Archer really had a lot to do with the staying power, the marketing and all of the different things they used to promote it, the board games, the memorabilia, which is very popular and things like that.
Yes, I've been to conventions where the memorabilia is being bought and sold and traded for, and it's there's an awful lot of it. We're going to have to stop the conversation there. I wish we had more time, but there really is a way in which Ted Williams was the perfect spokesman for Moxie, both things combining the bitter with the sweet, and both things very specifically styled to the tastes of New England, and maybe less popular with a less forgiving, larger American public, less forgiving of irascible baseball players, and less forgiving of somewhat bitter-tasting soft drinks. So there's some lovely parallels there. Nick Davis, thank you for stopping here on your way to Boston.
Thank you so much for having me. It was great.
And I really can't encourage you enough, even if you are baseball phobic, to try watching this documentary. You're going to meet a person who's so much more complicated than baseball itself. We didn't even get into things like fishing, which probably you're not a fan of either if you don't like baseball. But just to say, whatever he tried to do, he did it with a particular kind of intensity that you don't see anywhere else.
Summer, there's something so pleasant about you. Oh, you stand the test, for you are the best. I'll send all the rest down the line.